Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the Justus Parrotta 1988 podcast. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, be sure to follow me on Substack as well. So, for the first set of episodes, what I wanted to do was investigate an article by Allan Kozinn from the San Francisco Classical Voice, and I have a list of points that I'd like to discuss. The first one I would like to discuss applies to what I refer to as the three features of the composer-performers, which are create material that they know how to perform themselves. And then the second one is disseminate their own work. And the third one is make a library of their own work. And this foundation focuses on the analyses of articles from that perspective on the podcast. And one thing I will mention right away with the work of Allan Kozinn in this article called Return of the Composer-Performer to New Music by Virtuoso Musicians is that he states that the concept of composers performing their own work, it was quite normal during certain times in history, up until the 19th century when more composers focused on orchestra work, and there began to be somewhat of a wall between the composer and the performer, so it was completely separated from each other. And one thing I'm going to mention with it being completely separate from each other, there can be a lot of issues if you're promoting a certain style of classical music. One of the things he mentions right away is minimalism. So composers like Steve Reich or Terry Riley or John Adams, how that worked is that in the case of Reich, he performed his own music and founded Steve Reich and Musicians. Eventually, he started off with electronic music, built up to phasing music where he'd phase tape patterns like piano phase, violin phase, that he would do phasing instruments, and what that meant is that he'd have a pre-recorded track of a certain pattern being repeated, and then the live performer would slow down or speed up during the live performance, that is. So that's a really interesting technique. It has always been kind of a niche that I've been interested in as a composer. And this is something for me as a person who has studied keyboard and composition. I'm an organist, pianist, and composer. This has always been an interest of mine to investigate, was bringing back the concept of performing your own work, especially since I actually got to study with Dr. Barbara Lister-Sink at Salem College, who specializes in injury preventative keyboard technique, which one of the things she focuses on is downloading patterns to automaticity, and that's a big and key and crucial factor in writing your own music. It's easier to download patterns to automaticity. The other thing he mentions is a lot of traditional composers I'd say 1850, 1860, who were performing their own music. So John Doland, Diedrich Buxtehude, the Bach family, Mozart's, Beethoven, Schumann. He says Schumann, but it's not clear which one of the Schumanns. So honestly, I think it applies to both Robert and Clara. And then Brahms and Stravinsky. You also could include Olivier Messiaen in this list as well, even though he died in 1992, or Maurice Duruflé. And in the case of Schumann, he needs to be considered, Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann need to be considered in this particular genre, as that they were both composer-performers of their own work. And as the Romantic era went on, I actually think because of the Industrial Revolution and being able to print more stuff and build more instruments quickly, more people were able to access more music quickly, so it became easier to build an orchestra. So there was kind of a turning away from the composer-performer. The next thing that Kozinn talks about that I find that's really helpful is he provides a list of composers who he refers to, such as Mari Kimura or Timo Andres or Caroline Shaw. When I went to the comments section, one of the composers they talked about was Lara Auerbach. I looked at her work and it's quite extensive. So what this proves is that it's a gradual movement that's re-emerging. I almost kind of find it similar for me as an organist to the organ reform back in the 1960s, 1950s. I know there's a lot of controversy regarding the designs of the instruments when people were going back to using direct mechanical key action rather than it using sensors to control the keys and pipes. And that was good to some extent. I know there was a little bit of controversy regarding the style of how the pipes were voiced or what have you. But that movement, the Orgelbewegung, which is a German name, so organ reform, so looking at early music for the organ, because most of everything was more orchestral, that was a movement that promoted looking back and see what we previously did for the organ. And I also think the Orgelbewegung is a good vehicle for composers. The good aspects of it, not the more controversial aspects, such as just making everything sound like a screech box in some cases. Those viewpoints, especially with looking back and being like, we could do it this way, and that makes sense. Even though I know was a hard road with the Orgelbewegung in terms of getting everything ironed out. So thank you, and we will go to the next episode, which I will discuss the composers creating their own material and them being able to perform it themselves and creating material with patterns that they easily can download to Automaticity. Thank you very much.